Thank you very much for being here. We're going to get started. This is a joint committee meeting between the Public Safety Committee and the Education and Culture Committee. And today we have two items on our agenda. I'm going to be leading the first item, and Craig will be leading the second. For the first one, it's on the MCPS safety and security, and I'd like to call to the podium, to the stand here, Dr. Andy Zuckerman, Ed Clark, who's the MCPS Chief Safety Officer. Dr. Zuckerman is MCPS Chief Operating Officer. Todd Watkins, who's the Director of MCPS Department of Transportation. Assistant Chief Laura Lanham from Montgomery County Police Department. And Captain Elizabeth Haydenberg, Director of MCPD Community Engagement Division.
Mr. Katz, we also, if it's okay with you, would like to bring Mr. Charles McGee, Chuck McGee, our Director of Infrastructure and Operations for our Technology Division, too, who can be really helpful today.
Thank you very much. Has anybody ever told you no, Dr. Zuckerman? No, I mean, I'm just asking. Yeah. Anyhow, and the answer is yes, they have. But anyhow, if we could lead this off, please, and I guess Craig and Susan are going to be explaining this to us, please.
Thank you. So today is kind of a follow-up on some of the conversations that the council has had during the past two operating budget deliberations for FY18 and 19. The then Education Committee had lots of discussions about school safety and security around funding. And then in past summer in July, the joint committees received an update on the Maryland Safe to Learn Act of 2018. So for today's briefing, we asked MCPS and the police department to address 5 different issues, and we're kind of group them in 2 different sections. The first 2 are about funding. So it's a breakdown of how MCPS has spent or allocated the additional funding that the council has provided over the past 2 fiscal years, as well as a breakdown of the $28 million that they requested in additional capital funding related to school safety and security. Obviously, decisions on capital funding are still to be determined based on affordability, but we thought it would be helpful to have an understanding from MCPS of how they would plan to use that money, either as part of this coming budget that will be approved or in future budgets. Related to the operating funds, the council approved and MCPS worked together to approve about $5 million in additional funding beyond what had been in the board's request over the past couple of years. In FY17, we received some additional money from the state, about $4 million, so $2 million of that was used as fund balance carryover, so the council could fund the board's entire budget request, and MCPS used the remaining dollars for safety and security initiatives. And then last year, MCPS had requested supplemental appropriations of about $3 million to fund additional safety and security enhancements. The council and MCPS worked together to find some ways within existing budget resources to fund those requests. And so some of the items that the MCPS had asked for dollars for include controlled entrances and vestibules, access control systems, elementary school cameras, visitor management systems, and then radio and communications infrastructure. So we thought it'd be helpful to have MCPS go through each of those different items and explain where they are in the funding, how much has been spent, and kind of what they still have to do.
Thank you very much. And before we start, I did want to acknowledge and welcome Pat O'Neill, who's the Vice President of the Board of Ed, to be here. Thank you, Pat, for joining us. And who's going to lead this off, please? You?
I'd be happy to.
Okay.
So thank you, Mr. Howard, and thank you, council members, for your support, continued support, and partnership around the safety and security of our students and staff. Let me take it in the order of completion from what's been completed to where we are that's still a ways away from completion. So first of all, just with respect to visitor management systems, you may know those systems where you put your identification card down and it gets scanned in. We did a complete modernization and overhaul of that system, and they are now installed in all of our schools. We have guidelines and training that have gone out, so we have a new visitor management system, which is very helpful and a layer of protection. With respect to our security vestibules, we are working through that. We completed 8 in the summer. By January, we have another 8 schools that we're working through now, and the capital budget, the lion's share of that $28 million for security in that project description form that the board requested through an amendment is geared towards the remaining schools that need vestibules. So that is funding dependent. going forward. There's no sequencing of which schools would be first because we have to scope out and do our feasibility studies for these schools, and then we'll sequence it after that. They're complicated projects. You can think of some schools, for example, where offices are in the center of the building or farther away. We have to move those offices to the front, create the vestibules there. So that's why we're waiting for the funding for those. And there are other internal modifications, interior modifications to buildings that we noted in the packet, cross-corridor doors, for example, that have been very helpful in terms of just adding that extra layer of security. So the infrastructure it's continued to be a work in progress. With regards to elementary school cameras, you'll note in the packet we're deploying them. We've begun that process. Some of the delay has been just assessing the schools themselves as to where the appropriate placement is and having the teams going out to put those in. We anticipate putting about 4 to 5 cameras in each elementary school when it's all said and done, particularly looking for strategic areas, for example, main hallways where there's a T that comes to the center. So we have one right in the center, and you provide a line of sight down each one. Cameras, as you know, largely deterrents. And we use on the back end for investigative purposes, but they still are strong deterrents. So we want those in our elementary schools. Portable classrooms or side doors are another area where we're looking to put cameras. Access control systems, we're modernizing. Access control system is the system that you use to gain access into the building, the buzzer system. And really, like any technology, our access control system had essentially reached its end of life, for lack of a better term. We were putting more into maintaining it, so it really reached a point where we wanted to just do a complete modernization and upgrade. So that we're in the process of doing. That work has begun. The delay, just with that, just so you know, was that when Parkland, Florida occurred last year, tragically, the entire industry was upended. So there has been a backlog for a number of the items that we're talking about today in terms of just keeping pace, supply and demand. So that's the issue there.
But just to be clear on that one, every school right now has an access control system with the intercom and the camera, right?
Correct, yep.
Every school. Okay, thanks.
So this is about replacing it. And so
The upgrades. Okay.
It's an upgrade, exactly. And then lastly, and I'm going to ask Mr. Watkins, who can speak most clearly to this, our radio infrastructure. This project has actually taken longer than we would like. So part of what we need to do from a safety and security standpoint is upgrade the communication infrastructure. And we're starting that through our Department of Transportation, and Mr. Watkins can explain it, but we've had difficulty obtaining the new frequency to do this. So the money is encumbered, but it just hasn't been spent. The vast majority of it hasn't been spent. We have the plan to do it, but this project is just taking a little bit longer. Todd?
So we're poised and ready to go
You
on
can
this.
just identify yourself.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I mean, I
Todd
know who
Watkins,
you are.
Director of
Yeah.
Transportation for the school system. And we had anticipated being much further along in this project by now. But apparently there were some, our vendor tells us there were some changes in how the rules of frequency sharing were applied at the FCC. And so some frequencies that they anticipated being able to use because the next user is, in their opinion, far enough away when they did their engineering studies not to have interference, those tolerances have now been expanded. And so many of the frequencies that they planned to use in this new digital project suddenly became unavailable to us during the initial stages of the project. So they've been working very extensively with the FCC to identify others. And the process is when you identify another user that's within X amount of miles on a frequency that you want to use, you have to write to them and ask for permission for that to happen. They can either say yes or no. And it's been a long and cumbersome process, but they've been keeping us very updated on the progress on this, and I feel like they are making a valiant effort to get these frequencies as soon as possible. And we're poised and ready to go with the rest of it, with the digital repeaters. We have the sites identified, we have permission to use the towers, we have all of that. It's just a matter of getting these frequencies. So I think once that process is complete, the rest of this will flow very quickly. And then that will, once that infrastructure is built out in the tower sites, and I don't know if you remember, but this is the system we inherited from the police many, many years ago, when our department went from one frequency that we shared across all of our depots to having a frequency for each depot. Once that is set up, then it also opens the doorway for some upgrades in the schools with digital handheld radios in the schools that will allow countywide communication, communication to security leadership from each school, and the potential for interoperability with the police department at some level.
Okay.
And so I think, Mr. Howard, that provides just a synopsis and some words to what you had on paper here.
So any additional questions on the funding aspects before we move on to the other
Questions?
components?
Nope. Good.
Okay. The next three components, I'm going to talk about each of them a little bit, then we'll let police and MCPS staff go through their updates. But the first is the status of the implementation on the Maryland Safe to Learn Act of 2018. When the committees discussed this last July, everything was still in the initial stages of kind of figuring out what the legislation requires and how we might implement it both on the school system side and the police side. So we asked them to provide some updates on what's gone on since then. And then kind of building off of that is also a request for an update on how the schools and police are collaborating to review and revise emergency preparedness protocols in schools, and specifically how those are aligned with best practices. There's a lot of been discussion nationally on how to do different trainings with different cohorts of students and what's the right way to do those. And I know they've been working on revising those policies and practices. And then the last piece would be an update on the SRO School Resource Officer Program, including some revisions that are being looked at with regards to the Memorandum of Understanding, and also an update on the hours for the SRO officers, which we wanted the committee to hear about.
Who's going to lead it off?
Well, I'm going to start, but I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Clark, who pretty much wrote the Maryland Safe to Learn Act. So I feel as though you probably
So if we had any concerns at all, we should give Eddie a hard time. is
probably want to hear from him and Chief Lanham rather than me.
Yeah.
So Mr. Clark's our new Chief Safety Officer. We are glad to have him back in Montgomery County from the Maryland Center for School Safety.
Welcome.
Good afternoon, members of the council. My name is Ed Clark. I'm the Chief Safety Officer for Montgomery County Public Schools, and as Dr. Zuckerman alluded to, I was actively involved in working through the Maryland Safe to Learn Act last year as the Executive Director of the Maryland Center for School Safety. And as we all know, that act really changed school safety for us in the state of Maryland. Came upon the tragedy in Parkland, down there at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas School, but more importantly, a month later, down in St. Mary's counties, where we lost a young high school student to a senseless act of violence, and that really propelled the governor and the legislature to move forward with this act. Needless to say, that it's a very comprehensive and complex act, but we're working through it there. So some of the highlights as a result of the legislation being moved forward, our school district, as well as all other school districts, have appointed a school safety coordinator as well as a mental health services coordinator. In the act, there's a lot of mental health support provisions, call for wraparound services in there. Also, one of the big items is that every local school system by September 1st of 2019 has to have in place a model policy for behavioral threat assessment teams. The center has developed model guidelines. We are currently developing our own guidelines and protocols. They will certainly be in place so we can establish those required teams to intervene if we think a student, staff, or community member may be on a pathway of targeted violence there. So again, that's in collaboration, certainly an input with our law enforcement partners, because when it came to that critical moment, there would be an appropriate role for them to also assist in that type of intervention there also. We have been submitting data to the center on the number of SROs full-time. We have no part-time SROs. This year, every public school system in the state of Maryland had to report to the center and to the governor the status of SROs. If you did not have an SRO assigned to each public high school, you had to have a working, adequate law enforcement coverage plan. We're very, very fortunate here working with Chief Lanham and the Montgomery County Police and our municipal partners. We met that requirement. But for the start of the next school year, If you don't have an SRO in K through 12 schools, then you have to determine what that adequate local law enforcement coverage plan will be. So again, partnering with Captain Hattenberg and the chief and members of the department will be working over those plans over the summer there. The center's also sort of come out with guidelines for SRO coverage. Those documents have been shared with our law enforcement partners here in the county and throughout the state. We are required, like every other school district, to have school safety evaluations, and I had nothing to do with this timeline, but the timeline is very tight. These evaluations need to be done before June 15th of this year. So we have applied for a school safety grant from the center. We're waiting to hear back on that. That will allow us to conduct these assessments after the normal academic day. Again, our SROs will be partnering with us on those evaluations at the high school level. And we're working on a comprehensive evaluation tool to kind of assess where we are strong and if we detect any gaps. So we are looking to be on target for that requirement of the Maryland Safe to Learn Act. We also applied for, there was 2 sets of statewide grants. We applied for a Safe Schools grant. We were approved for that grant. We just had to make some modification. That's going back for final approval, but that will allow us to enhance school safety and security through additional use of technologies, but more importantly, training for behavioral threat assessment and mental health evaluation opportunities for our schools.
I just want to point out that that grant was approximately $1.2 million that we were approved for.
The big grant. And the other one, I think, is about almost 400,000, roughly.
The evaluation grant is mid-threes, and then the last grant, the capital budget grant, was also about 1.2 million for security vestibules that we have been approved for as well. But it's just a small, little bit of what we need to do in light of what I said about the comprehensive nature and complex nature of the vestibule work we have to do.
And there's another requirement for all school resource officers, as well as any school system safety and security employees, to participate in a 40-hour SRO curriculum designed by the center. Much of that curriculum focuses on prevention, intervention, outreach, and support, not necessarily suppression. So we've been given an opportunity to hold that training in June for our school safety staff members at the conclusion of the school year. And again, we're working with Captain Hattenberg and Chief Lanham for the SROs. So if the SROs have not gone through a similar curriculum in the last 2 years, they will have to attend that training statewide as well. So that's a very important curriculum, and we're excited about those training opportunities. So that's kind of where we are in terms of the Safe to Learn Act. A lot of things are in that law, but we've met all the deadlines, and we continue to partner with the Maryland Center for School Safety on those requirements. And there's a lot of other reporting requirements that have to come through the local school districts to the center, to the governor's office for just general updates where we are throughout the state. And Chief Lanham, if you have anything to add on the act, there are some other requirements that really come into play for our law enforcement communities as well.
Starting to feel like it was Jeopardy with this button here.
Wow.
My turn. Yeah, I know. Laura Lane, I'm Assistant Chief of Police for Montgomery County, I think, as you all know. I just want to back up a little bit, and everybody here knows that the safety of the schools didn't start because of the act that occurred in the state of Maryland. And I think nothing speaks to that better than when you look at the guidelines issued by the Maryland Center for School Safety. And if you look at what the rest of the state is doing, it is pretty much across the board, nothing that Montgomery County wasn't already doing, and we're doing better. Just some of the requirements are training. We decided that was important many years ago, and every summer we put our SROs through a 40-hour class. That isn't new. Obviously, you know, we're going to have to meet their exact standards that they want those classes to be, but we had already worked with a national organization to do that last summer again. We felt a lot of these things were important, that we were going to be required to track use of force and report it out. Again, that's something that we have done across the board. It's something that's always been important to the police department. We just didn't segregate the SROs out because we feel that's important, again, across the board, but it's easy for us to do since we're already doing it. The MCPS has been a great partner. We appreciate the opportunity for some money from the state because I think that does help to move us forward. But again, this isn't anything new for us, and we're glad to get even better at it.
Thank you, Chief. Councilmember Jawando, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good to see everybody. Chief Lanham, thank you. A couple questions. One, first related to mental health, and direct this to you, sir. I'm glad to see the additional requirement and that we've moved ahead with the identifying, maybe this is for you too, Dr. Zuckerberg, of the mental health coordinator. Could you talk to me a little bit about the roles and responsibilities of that person and what function you see them playing in the overall system? And I'll give you the context. I had a great meeting with Dr. Bryce a couple weeks ago to talk about, and I know you have some plans that you're rolling out around training the rest of the school staff, all the 20,000+ to, at various points when they encounter our students, to be able to identify and have some level of mental health, if not training, referral ability, and those things. You can mention that if you will, too, and what the role of this person, this role in particular, will be in that kind of mix of mental health and the overall strategy that you have.
I'll start just from the state law, the perspective. It was to really assist with wraparound services. Unfortunately, it was sort of an unfunded mandate from the state. That person is to sort of coordinate the overall mental health support and outreach of the school district, partnering with local providers, working with schools, other stakeholders to, when a student is identified in need of mental health services, to sort of coordinate that. I don't want to say like an ombudsman, but sort of a coordinator within each local school district to ensure that, as best we can, nothing sort of slips through the cracks there. So I'll turn it back to Dr. Zuckerman to kind of tell about how we're fulfilling that role within MCPS.
So thank you for the question. It's a great question. I think from our perspective, there's the mental health aspect of this cannot be overstated. I mean, it is Ed Clark and Christina Connolly, our director of psychology services, are joined at the hip when it comes to the implementation of the Maryland Safe to Learn Act. They're doing, for example, a series of town hall conversations with parents and community members around the county. It would have been easy for us to just have our chief safety officer or think about this from a safety and security standpoint, but Christina and Ed together are having these conversations. The policy, for example, that we're developing is co-led by both Mr. Clark and Dr. Conley. The threat assessment component to it is not so much a physical threat assessment, although that's a part of it, but understanding when students are presenting with crisis moments. And oftentimes that may not result in violence in the school, but really be about the psychological and emotional support we need to provide for a child. So each school team, we envision each school having a team that will focus on understanding how our students are presenting. And at the system level, Christina Connolly, along with Ed Clark, are coordinating that effort. We look at the two as working together. In fact, Mr. Clark, who's very modest, was recently awarded last week an award by the National Association of School Psychologists. So this is our chief safety officer getting a national award down in Atlanta by the Psychology Association in Public Education. So we look at the two as going hand in hand. And the last thing I'll just say is, and I think you alluded to this with Dr. Bryce, there's a more of a global look at just how we're approaching mental health and psychological supports for students, even just down to the curricular and pedagogical level, where we want to train our staff and our teachers to understand what are best practices related to trauma-informed instruction for students who are bringing backgrounds and experiences that are coming to bear on their own education. So it's a very holistic approach, and in just a brass tacks term, like Mr. Clark said, we need a point person to coordinate all of that. So,
And that'll be in central office.
correct.
Okay, great. And then, thank you, that's helpful. Second question, and I was very also happy to hear, Mr. Clark, about the movement forward on the additional SRO training. And one along those lines, I know recently this current SRO MOU that we have in our packet here was developed, and just looking at the definition, a school resource officer is a sworn uniformed law enforcement officer trained in emergency preparedness, crisis management, community policing concepts, and problem solving, who is assigned to work as a liaison with MCPS. I'm not sure if it was considered, I know we have some of our school board members here. I think the more we can put in these, when we define what an SRO is, the great training and work that you're doing around, whether it be prevention, away from that suppression, intervention, positive behavioral supports, just define, and it may be a word or two that could I just think we want to constantly emphasize, we understand that part of it, that they're not in the schools to police students in that sense, and that they're supportive in parts of the community. And so that's just one area I just wanted to bring out as an example that I think it could help to slide it in there and just to further emphasize the great work that we're already doing. And if you want to comment on that, you can. But
And the state was very proactive in that regard because there's a lot of requirements for de-escalation training, problem-solving, community policing. The focus is more intervention and prevention than it certainly is for arrest. Now, we know if there's a serious event, then the law enforcement team has to conduct a thorough investigation and take appropriate measures. But outside of that is building those relationships. So there are requirements. We think this is a very, very good curriculum for the state that was developed by the center as opposed by the Maryland Police Training Commission. So that was sort of something new. And there was a gap. We, as Chief Lanham said, they were really proactive in providing this training before. But there was never a state requirement to have school resource officers trained within the state of Maryland. So now we have a national curriculum to really make sure that law enforcement is appropriately trained, and we continue to build those partnerships along the way.
well, again, and thank you for your work in making sure that we had that. And I don't know, Chief, if you want to say anything.
Yeah, and I think the council's had good experience with us. If you look at our arrest numbers at the schools, for example, this year, the number one area we arrested people for was weapons. This is not a situation where you see a overbearing police force. There's the center of what they do is outreach. Back to the training. The training's for the entire state, but 2 of those classes are being held in Montgomery County. I mean, that really speaks to our involvement, our commitment to this.
And I just wanted to note that last year I went to a couple of hours. I mean, you had hours of training, but I did go to a couple hours, and it was very impressive, not just for the training, but for the people involved and how much they were involved in the training itself. So congratulations on that. Councilmember Albanese.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is a great panel. I've had the opportunity to work with all of you in some capacity and can speak to just how professional and dedicated you guys are to your craft. So I just want to start from that standpoint. Just to elaborate on something that Councilmember Jawando said, the Collaboration Council in partnership with MCPS and through Excel Beyond the Bell conducted social emotional training for the SROs affiliated with those schools. And this was about 5 years ago, and it was absolutely a best practice. The SROs raved about the training, and we know how important they are to not just ensure the safety of our students and staff in schools, but they're a critical glue and a link, and often establish a great deal of trust with oftentimes the students that are the most vulnerable within those schools. And so many of the officers shared with us having access to information that they weren't sure what to do with and how to process and where to refer to. And so that training several years ago was very productive, and I'd recommend that we look at doing something like that again if we haven't done that already. The other aspect as a best practice is we had bus drivers go through the training as well, because oftentimes, particularly with regards to bullying, it's on those school buses where we see that manifest itself in a very real and raw and dangerous way. And of course, our bus drivers their number one focus is to go from point A to point B. And so that also was a productive training, and I would encourage us to look at that opportunity as well. There is one area of vulnerability with regards to school safety that I did want to bring to the panel's attention, and I know we've had these conversations before, but in that after-school space, after the last bell is rung, as we know, there are hundreds, if not thousands, of students that remain in the schools, as they should be, in enrichment activities and sports and clubs and after-school programs, and that's where we want them. But I have observed that many of those well thought out and well covered policies end And of course, there remains an area of vulnerability there that is a byproduct of the successful outcome of more after-school programs. And so that is something that I think that as a matter of policy, we need to tackle system-wide rather on a case-by-case basis, which is basically what we're doing now. So that would be an area for us to focus on. Go ahead, Mr. Zuckerman, if you want to comment on that.
I just think that if our principals were here in the room right now, they would be clapping and cheering for what you're saying, because every time we talk with principals, particularly high school principals, about safety and security, the first thing that comes to mind are the after-school hours. And we've been thinking about how do we look at resourcing that differently. There might be a policy issue that you raise. We've had conversations with our colleagues at Community Use of Public Facilities, ICB, as we look at the new MOU that, or re-signing our MOU with ICB. You're 100% right. And I would just add to what you're saying that 2 years ago, we commissioned a study of safety and security by two subject matter experts, Bill Modulewski from the U.S. Department of Ed, retired, and Jim Kelly, retired Chief of Police for the Palm Beach County Public Schools. They came up, they studied the school system. Our focus was less on some of the hard infrastructure that's going into the Maryland Center for School Safety evaluations and more on interventions, relationships with adults. And they're too big. They had a lot of takeaways, but the two biggest takeaways they had were, number one, relationships with kids matter more than anything else as far as promoting positive safety, to your first point. And the second thing was that they said was we have to figure out the after-school component. That was something that they identified. So we would welcome that conversation. It's something that maybe we can look at with council staff and county executive staff as well, and the police, and think about how as a community, it's not just students that we're worried about, but the schools are in use as public facilities, not just our kids who that's our primary concern as a school system, but we have many residents, thousands of them in the school. So I echo what you're saying and appreciate it very much.
And then the last thing for now is, and thank you for that. I appreciate those comments. I had the opportunity about a month ago, I guess, to attend a session hosted by the Commission for Children and Youth, and they brought a number of students from across the county, and it was a really strong representation of students. It was very diverse geographically and demographically across the county. And one thing that was interesting was a number of students reported not feeling safe within their own schools, but not from an outside shooter or some of these god-awful things that we're saying, but among their peers. And it was oftentimes the SRO officers who was pointed to as somebody that was somebody safe they could go to report an incident involving student-on-student violence. And with the advent of social media, I know that our security team is, as well as law enforcement, trying to look as far upstream as possible and be proactive, talking to parents, trying to educate them on social media. But it just was interesting. The students that reported out wanted more security, not less, within their schools, specifically because of their concerns over peer-to-peer violence. So as we look at this safety issue, viewing it holistically is so important, and I can't thank all of you for your work. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Councilmember Hawker, please.
Had a point of that. That's been an issue with the state level. We've looked at the last couple of years, that gap after the school hours, that's a concern. So the state is looking at as well. But I also want to just sort of bring up about the piece about the social media and the threats that have occurred. And this speaks to the partnership with Montgomery County Police and our other law enforcement partners. We have seen an increase not only here in this county but throughout the state of these really threatening social media posts. And what has occurred throughout the state and here in Montgomery County is that our law enforcement partners, when they receive this information, they will evaluate it. It will be assigned out. And the chief can speak more to this than I can. But then they're going out and making what we call home visits. And following the tragedy in St. Mary's County, what St. Mary's came up with, they're putting law enforcement boots in the living room at 2 a.m., especially when a gun is mentioned in a social media thread, to have that conversation with the parents, with the students, to ensure there's no credibility with the threats. Mm-hmm. We are following that same approach here with Chief Lanham and the county police team here. Then there's the loop back, so then we can loop back with the building principal, so the building principal can indicate to the school community that there was no credibility to this threat. Now, we may see additional police presence the next day, just as a reassurance. But again, that partnership is so important here between the police department and the school system, and going out and taking those proactive measures. That's a national best practice for us here in this county and throughout the state, putting those boots in the living room in a non-accusatory way. But the one threat that we don't run down may be the one that really, really hurts us all.
Thank you. Councilmember Hucker, please.
That sounds like a great approach. Thank you. Thank you all for being here and for the helpful briefing and for your diligence on this topic. I mean, we're going to receive briefings on dozens of topics this year, and I can't think of any topic more important than this one. So thank you for all your work on that. Just a few quick questions that haven't been asked. One is back to the visitor management system. I think that's a very important piece, especially cross-referencing with the sex offender registry. Did you say when that will be implemented?
It's currently being implemented. That
You know, when it'll be finished, I mean.
it is complete.
Oh, it is?
The new visitor
Terrific.
management system is 100% installed. That was our first thing.
Great, thank you. Quick question about key fobs. MCPS IDs, are there any MCPS IDs that have entrance-exit technology in the IDs? Who has them? And is that being integrated with the vestibule upgrades?
Yes, so school staff at a school location, an employee at a particular employee location, we can code your ID badge so that you can enter if you're an employee. One thing I would so the answer is yes. I'm sure Assistant Chief Lanham would like me to say that we're also working with the police right now on providing access to police officers, that they have the appropriate emergency access. So we're in the process of working out an agreement about how that can be as well. So employees do currently for their work location. The superintendent obviously can swipe into any building that he goes to, and there's a few folks, but generally employees at their work site.
Mm-hmm. Are there any risks that come with that from your point of view, Ed, in terms of like, have you ever seen borrowing badges or people losing badges, anything like that?
No, not at this juncture, because once it's a lost badge, we can purge automatically through the system.
Right.
So we have accountability, we can do runs. Each building principal will set the hours or the parameters when staff can come in. So it's really a much more, I think, restrictive and a lot more accountability using technology with the cards.
Just like our badges, just like a hotel people. I've gotten that question before, so I wanted to hear you answer it. I had a question also about emergency preparedness and active threat drills. Number of parents have asked about the psychological impact of those drills on especially young children, and what you're thinking around that, and how do you mitigate against that?
I believe that's one of the other topics we're here to discuss, so we'll just kind of go over that quickly. Sure. We are expanding our approach where lockdown used to be the primary response strategy in these active assailant situations. But following national and state level best practices, we, working again with our police partners and Lieutenant Brian Dillman, who is the SWAT tactical commander, we've taken a different approach. We call it the lockdown with options. So it's based on the premise of avoid, deny, and defend. We've worked very hard with our police partners, our principals. All of our high schools have been trained, staff have been trained, the students have been trained in these concepts. We've just recently completed training at the staff level for the middle schools as well as the students. We're now ready to embark at the elementary school level, but again, working with Dr. Connolly, we need to do that in an age-appropriate way where we are not scaring students or parents or raising the level of anxiety. It's just presenting options. So when we get to that elementary school level, the primary approach would be for students to follow the direction of staff or their principals. The other drills are engaging different scenarios, so we're not really going to engage in those scenario discussions. But I'm here to say that we have not, nor do we anticipate doing any live drills. I think there's a lot of concern out there where these full-scale functional drills, unannounced drills, we will not do that. We certainly have put out notices to our parent community when we're embarking on that training. And the next phase would be when the weather breaks a little bit to actually go beyond when we move to that safe location where we flee or avoid, to make sure that we can get to a safe landing spot within the community there. So we don't want to have the drills where the students go out, they don't come back the rest of the school day, but we may have adults just to the boundary of that school perimeter there, and to say, okay, good, where would you go? If you're in danger, you would continue to go beyond, but go back in now, then we'll debrief. So I will say this, at the high school level, I've been very, very impressed with the maturity. I wasn't sure whether our students were ready for this discussion. Even the middle school students are ready. They understand the risk. And in one high school in particular, it was a school, Seneca Valley, that had a special needs component at their school. The training was led by a teacher and co-led by a student. What's most impressive in that training was the concern of the general student body for those special needs students to make sure that their interests were taken care of during an emergency or crisis. It was very heartwarming to see our students caring so much about all students with different levels of abilities. So I think we're in a good place. We're working with our PTA partners as well, having these community conversations just to allay the fear or apprehension of parents that we're trying to do it right, but following those national best products, because we now know one size does not fit all. So we need to give options.
Thank you. And you said your staff receive trauma-informed training. What do you do if a student is experiencing a traumatic reaction during a?
Well, certainly during the training, our counselors are there to provide support and outreach, as well as for staff members. This is a difficult conversation for staff to have when we're talking about a very critical, high-profile incident there. So again, those support services are there. So principals are meeting with students afterwards at lunch, having discussions. The SROs are involved at the high school level just to kind of reinforce we're going to get through this, but we need to have these conversations.
You remove a child who might be having a traumatic reaction in the middle of the drill?
Yes, they can be with that counselor or with the principal or someone else there, yes.
Right, okay, they're
Just to
relocated.
clarify, I want to clarify two things, what Mr. Clark said. Number one, this is not so much a drill as it is a scenario-based discussion at an age-appropriate level. And so high school students can obviously discuss this topic differently than elementary. And we actually brought in elementary teachers and counselors to design the lesson plan to have with students in elementary. So it's a conversation that in the long run will lead to some level of drill, not the type of live unannounced drill that we would never do that. But we've been really careful to do this incrementally so that we socialize these concepts across the school system in the county. The easiest thing in the world to do would have been in August to pull every teacher together, every principal, and for 4 hours do a active assailant training. And that would have, in my opinion, been a terrible mistake. It would have scared people. It would have created chaos. We've been really, really intentional. We trained all of our principals in small groups this summer, groups of 20 to 30, so they could have those the discussions that counselors were available if they wanted to talk, employee assistants. So we've just been moving incrementally because of exactly the types of questions you're asking.
Thank you. And finally, just a quick question about SROs. How's the retention rate? Are you satisfied with it? And are there any gaps that you need to fill with MCP officers or anybody else?
So luckily, we weren't sure what would happen when we changed the schedule, quite honestly, when beginning of the school year changed it to a 5-day work week. We have not had any officers leave as a result of that. We had one this year leave due to an opportunity to become an investigator, so that's progression in your career. But we have had, real commitment to the program. There's not a lot of benefits other than personally to being a school resource officer, and they are absolutely committed to that program. And you can tell that by switching from a 4-day-a-week schedule to a 5-day-a-week, which is personally, causes a big drain on their lives. But they stayed with it and have continued to.
So there's been some pushback, but not loss of staff over that?
Verbally, we talked for probably a good 2 straight hours of them venting. Which you could understand. They really didn't see it coming. They didn't. They had not taken the job knowing that was going to be a requirement. So all of a sudden they're in a job maybe they've been doing for years. They felt well, and even one of the SROs had a special needs child who she would spend that 1 day a week at that child's school with the child. So you could understand personally how that was. But they all stayed with the program. They all stayed committed.
That's good to hear. So then when an SRO takes leave, do you fill that gap with another SRO, or do you have to pull in any beat officer?
So we don't have extra SROs, so that can't happen where another SRO comes in. There's a multitude of things that happen, depending on if it's a last-minute leave, it's a known, they're off for the week. At a bare minimum, you have your beat officers stopping by. If it's a long-term absence, we try to have somebody assigned. As you can imagine, with like the 4th District having 6 high schools, and the 1st District having 7, that them are uniquely challenged at the coverage. But we based on the amount of officers we have in beats and the amount of officers out in the area of the schools, we've been able to find a way to have them covered and people stopping by at the absolute minimum.
Okay, great. So you don't interpret the adequate coverage requirement in the state law as somebody being on site necessarily at all time, but somebody in the vicinity?
No, and most of the state does not have that.
Right. Okay, great. Thank you very much.
There are different models, but working with local law enforcement, we feel really good where we are. And again, that adequate law enforcement coverage will now apply for next school year, K through 12. Also, if the governor's funding comes forward in the Safe to Learn Act this year, there will be $10 million for local sheriffs and chiefs to apply for additional school resource officers throughout the state.
Great. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr.
Thank you. Councilmember Navarro.
Thank you very much. This has been a really useful briefing. I think that there is no doubt that, the SRO issues have evolved quite well throughout the years. When I served on the Board of Education, there was some trepidation with how to move forward without specific MOU or training and things of that nature, and I think we've really come a long way. So really hope that we can get some funding from the state to see if we can expand. My colleague, Councilor Albornoz, alluded to something very important as well. Our last youth town hall was, I would say, almost like 90% of the feedback from the students had some connection to not feeling safe in their schools and issues of bullying and things like that. And especially with our high school students, which it becomes a little bit more of a challenge because they don't want to really share a lot of this. We had a situation, I think, at Paine Branch High School where there was a particular house a block away from the school where there were some negative activities and students feeling threatened. And I think there was an issue with one student actually. There was a shooting or something like that. And so students not even being able to walk to their school because they didn't feel safe. And so I hope that as we are looking at this issue broadly, that we look at ways or best practices as well to address this. I don't know if, I was thinking the other day, could there be like a hotline for students in high school to report these types of challenges, because they seem to know very well who's what's happening, who's doing it, et cetera. They just don't want to obviously share it for obvious reasons. So maybe that's already happening because I'm seeing everybody sort of nodding.
Yeah, we'll go. There is a hotline, but it's more for emergency where there's a threat to the school. And I think what Ed is trying to do is migrate it more towards what you're saying. I'll let him speak.
That would be so.
He's been a real champion of
That would be
this
so incredible, because like I said, you should look at the footage from that last town hall, and it was just so clear to me that there's a lot happening that is just not being reported in the usual way. So if you can share what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, a spinoff to the Safe to Learn Act was established by the governor for the statewide school safety tip line. And we've done a pretty good job here in Montgomery County of sharing that information with our students, our community members, and staff, because we lead the number of tips that have come through. Again, working in collaboration with our police partners. When those calls come in, they're evaluated. And as Dr. Zuckerman said, not so much school violence, but it's kids who are coming forward with other students who are in crises. And one example is at 11:30 at night, came in working with, again, our police partners. A student was in serious mental health crisis. Working with the police department, a home visit was made, interventions were made. Information through Dr. Conley was looped back through the building principal. The building principal had already been working with student, but there were extra efforts and wraparound services to support this young student who really was in crisis. And I'm absolutely convinced that we saved that student's life that evening. So again, trying to get that word out to more students. These are the type of things that you can report confidentially. We had a social media threat, I think last week and the weekend before last, that came through the tip line, but it also came through the 911 Public Safety Center. And again, immediate response well into the late hours of the evening. But again, working with our police partners and the detectives, an intervention was made in that case there.
So I would just encourage all of us, I guess, to redouble our efforts in order to spread the word about, the fact that this exists, that students, can access this in some kind of a public education campaign that is hip and cool, so everybody, pays attention to it. But I think it is important to continually reinforce this. And then lastly, I hope also that we are connecting all this work with the Street Outreach Network that we have also invested some resources into, because they also have, I think, a pretty good handle on particular areas of the community, and there's, that trust there as well. And with all of those, resources, I think that, we should feel pretty good about being able to address a lot of these.
And part of the money in the grant funding was for outreach.
Excellent.
For the hotline.
Great.
We've met with Luis and his team to kind of reestablish those partnerships and sharing information and problem solving. So,
Wonderful.
yeah, well, I think we're all in this together.
Yes.
And making sure we knock down any silos that exist, because we have to, in today's environment, we have to really connect all of those school safety dots.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you, and I know we have a couple more things to go through. I think we've been through a lot of these at various moments, but could we touch on, and I know, Ed, you've been involved in this as well, but the non-public special education schools for their safety as well. Obviously, it's a great concern, and can you touch on that a little bit, what we can do?
I can. That is a gap that does exist in the current law. Even though those non-public education schools like Ivy Mountain, some other schools, they will take in students from this county and the surrounding areas. They have sort of been, I don't think, purposely omitted, but all the funding has been directed to the public school system. So I think there have been conversations this year with the governor's team and the legislature to try to close those gaps. But we will partner with any of our non-public private schools to share the resources we have. Also with our police partners, they've been involved in meetings with Ivy Mount. I will say this, I think the Ivy Mount School, what they have done at their school in terms of embracing police partnerships, emergency preparedness, is really not only a model within this state, but the entire country. What they have done with very limited funding is phenomenal. So I think that anything that we all can collectively do to support them in creating funding opportunities, either at the local or the state level, I think we should work to support them, because those risks are there for them just as much as it is in the public schools. And, they deal with special populations. So the more training and outreach and support that can be provided to those particular schools, all of our schools are that much more safer. So I appreciate you bringing that up, and hopefully we can close that gap collectively.
Well, and I applaud you and everyone at this panel and beyond for working with them. I know Ivy Mount in particular, but I know others as well, that we really do need to figure out a better way to do what we're doing. So anyhow, we're going to turn back to Mr. Howard.
In the course of the, all the questions that the council members have asked, we've hit on and covered all the key issues that staff had identified and asked the panel to address.
Good. Thank you. Councilmember Rice, please.
Well, thank you very much. And we've had a very robust discussion, and I will just say I want to, thank my colleagues who were here when we faced a very difficult time when it came to school safety. And Montgomery County was actually, I think, at the right time, at the right moment in terms of stepping up and saying we wanted to restore our school resource officer program. We wanted to take school security seriously. And that was one in which we were actually going in the opposite direction and really stepping away from having those resources in our schools. And so I really think it was a great time for us, and it set ourselves up for where we are right now. It gave us an opportunity, however, to create a very strong and robust MOU. And thank you Councilmember Jawando for paying close attention to that. I will say that one of the things, and we'll probably need to flush out a bit more as we talk about it, what all those things that you espoused as your concerns are truly the community policing model. And it really is something that I know our police department is committed to moving towards and continuing to highlight for us that community policing is the best way to ensure that we don't have the same kind of incidents that we see that happen throughout these United States of America, where police don't have a relationship with their community and so therefore oftentimes have these kinds of incidents that happen. And it's not to say that Montgomery County isn't perfect. We certainly are not, and we have our challenges as we employ individuals. And individuals come with their own sorts of challenges and great things, and every now and then you may have something that doesn't work. But the reality is that I think we've got a very strong policy that says this is what's guiding us. One of the things that I did want to highlight that Assistant Chief, you said that is concerning to me, and I would like to see us pay a little bit more attention to this. Unfortunately, this year we're going to have a tough budget. Last year we added 3 additional school resource officers to start going into our middle schools, which I think was a great direction for us. But not only that, but it will start to allow for some of the flexibility that was questioned by Councilmember Hucker. If you do need someone to go from a middle school where we know that there's less volume, there's still volume, but less volume, and go to a high school for coverage, those are the kinds of things that give us that flexibility. So growing our cohort will certainly help us along those lines. But the thing that you said about advancement is something that I've been paying very close attention to as well. And I really would like to see us start to think about opportunities for us to have opportunities for advancement within our school resource officer program, to encourage folks to stay and have them, as they've been in the program for a long time, to be able to look forward to maybe being in a position of leadership, to then train other people that are coming in, especially as we are opening up this opportunity for more schools, to give them that background. Not to say the great job that you do, because you do, but you're spread across and have so much responsibility that's there. I really would like to see us start to build an infrastructure within our school resource officer program like we see in other jurisdictions. And so I think that benefits of the career piece that you talked about, while it's great, and I'm about to spend some time with the school resource officer this Friday, and I make sure that I do these kinds of things so I can get out there, not only to see what's happening with our schools, but with our resource officers as well. It really is, I think, the next step for us. And so I'm happy to hear you say that our officers are committed. You know it, because they are. They're committed to our kids. They're committed to making sure that they're in there for the right reasons. And that's a tremendous plus for us. But I would like to, in fairness, also see us as a county give something back to those folks who are dedicating themselves and are truly committed to our kids also. So I look forward to having those conversations. Again, it's not something that's right, unfortunately, for this time frame, being with all the other difficulties we have when it comes to budgetary constraints, but it is something that I hope and look forward to in the future as we grow our school resource officer program.
Thank you very much. We're going to have the next panel, please. And you're going to do that one.
All right, so we're going to go ahead and get started. I have Dr. Donna Hollingshead, as well as Greg Edmondson, Dr. Henry Johnson, and Joshua Sivan, all from MCPS. And I think we've got Debbie Feinstein here with us as well, from the Montgomery County State's Attorney's Office. And we may not have space for everybody at the table, but Wendy Greer with Child Welfare Services, DHHS, Suzanne Shook with DHHS, CWS as well. I know that we have Lynn Harris from our MCC PTA, who's here with us, as well as Jillian Huebner, who's also with MCC PTA, head of the Safety Committee. The reason why we're having this update, and so, Mr. Howard, I'll turn it over to you in a second, but we've been talking for a long time about ensuring that we can do everything to ensure our children are safe when it comes to those outside threats and security from that aspect, but also when it comes to ensuring that in their own home environments and in the environments that they live, that we're ensuring their safety as well. When it comes to child abuse and neglect, as we talk about our opportunity and achievement and equity gaps that exist, it is incredibly important to understand that there are children who unfortunately are subject to different kinds of environments when they go home, and those environments have a heavy role to play in terms of how that child is able to then perform in schools. And so, as we talk about the outside of school day and really understanding that we can do so much within school walls, but we also need to address what happens to that child outside of school, whether it's having access to quality meals as a whole, or even meals that are of quality, or if it's being in an environment in which they are not subject to neglect or abuse, is incredibly important. And so we always want to make sure that we're doing the best we can to equip our teachers, administrators, and faculty that are in the building as a whole, all of our school employees, about recognizing and understanding the signs of abuse, and then making sure that we have the right actions, whether those actions are removing a child in certain situations, or ensuring that that child and the parents are given the support necessary so that they can learn how to have a better relationship with their child and be more supportive of their child, and ensure that there's the right kind of environment for them to be successful. And so, there's been a lot of talk also about not just the home environment, but what happens within our schools, and making sure that when it comes to our employees that are working within our school system, that have interactions with our children, that they also are folks who have nothing but the best intentions. As I said before in my previous conversation about our police officers, we hire individuals, and all of those individuals come with all of their own different kind of accoutrements, and some are good and some are bad. And that's unfortunate, and the most responsible thing for us to do is to ensure that if you have someone who does not have the best intentions for our children, that we identify them immediately and remove them so that they no longer have that sort of impact. And so we really look forward to hearing about how we can strengthen those efforts to ensure that our children remain safe, whether it's inside of our school walls or outside of them, and how we can continue to focus on what's most important for our children, ensuring that they have access to a great educational experience that's going to set them up for success in their future lives. So with that, I'll turn it over to Mr. Howard.
Thank you. Let me just give a little bit of background and set up the framework for the discussion, then I'll turn it over to Dr. Hollingshead to lead us through MCPS's update. Back last April, the full council had a work session on workplace harassment policies and procedures across all the different county agencies, and that focused on employee to employee types of harassment and issues. And stemming from that, the Education Committee asked for a update from MCPS specific to child abuse and neglect, since that was a topic that also came up during those discussions. So we had that briefing on April 25th, and at that time the committee asked for a follow-up briefing in 2019 to kind of build on, to learn a little bit more about what MCPS had done since then. So today's discussion is primarily focused around two documents that are attached to the packet. The first is an August 29th memorandum from the superintendent to the Board of Education, and that's the annual update on the child abuse and neglect policies and procedures that's required under the Board of Education's policy. And the second is a memorandum from the superintendent to the chair of the Education Committee, and that answered some specific follow-up questions and comments that came out of that April 25th work session that the committee had. MCPS has provided, as they did in April, a whole bunch of background materials and information. Each of the committee members has one of these large packets that MCPS provided. It's a lot of kind of background information and attachments that we don't anticipate going through today, but so you'll all have those. A lot of those are the same documents that were provided for the April work session. So what I did for the packet is we have the link to the April packet online, so folks who aren't here can access all that same information. And any of the documents that have been updated since April, I attached to the packet, so they're a little bit more accessible if we want to go through any of those. And then the rest of the packet, I've laid out 8 different discussion topics based on the updates MCPS has provided, and we'll let Dr. Hollingshead run through all those as well as any other updates she wants to give. Then after that, on page 4 of the packet, I did put together some multi-year data from the annual reports that MCPS provides to the Board of Education, so we can talk about that a little bit after we hear about the other updates.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I'm Donna Hollingshead, Associate Superintendent, School Administration. And as our folks speak, if they would introduce themselves, you heard their names. The only person that I wanted to make note of in the audience is Mrs. O'Neill from our Board of Education, who was instrumental in the development of this revised child abuse and neglect policy. So we thank her for being here today. So you can see it takes multiple county government agencies to take care of this village of children that we have. And you just heard that update on the general safety and security for all of MCPS. But if we have students who don't feel safe, they're going to have a harder time focusing and learning. It's that simple. And so this work is not an add-on to education, but rather a precursor to their education. So our students have to be safe and secure, and we have to provide that environment. And that's our priority every day. So we appreciate the opportunity to speak about child abuse and neglect and raise community awareness at any opportunity, because there's a lot of information out there that if people just knew, then they would be able to act. And so everything that we're going to talk about today is on our website. We encourage people to go there. So nothing is anything that we're unveiling here. We just wanted to share an update of what's gone on since we last came. And also, Councilmember Rice gave us a number of suggestions that we have followed up on, and certainly you'll hear some specifics about that as well. So going to the policy, just for the benefit of the audience that doesn't know about it, but in 2015, MCPS embarked on, and I'm just going to call it an overhaul of our processes around child abuse and neglect. And there were 2 critical outcomes to highlight: a safe, engaging, and supportive environment for all our students through vigilant efforts by all the MCPS community to recognize, report, and prevent child abuse and neglect and vulnerable adults. And the second is for us to effectively collaborate with partner agencies in doing this work as we investigate reports of suspected abuse and neglect, and then provide the support to the children who have been victims of such abuse. And that's why you see our partner agencies here who are critical to the work that we do every day. So we report instances, and then once we report, the work's not over. There's a whole lot of work to do from that point. So leading up to the revisions in the policies, we consulted multiple experts, national experts, our county partner agencies here, and multi-stakeholders in the community as we kind of reframed this work and had extensive cross-functional input. The revisions reaffirmed the Board of Education's commitment to making sure that our students were safe, not just physically, but mentally and emotionally, and you just spoke about that in the preceding topic. So the policy and the protocols that follow have made our schools safer and our system stronger. So some of the background information that I want to provide that was in this large notebook that's kind of daunting to look at. But since last year, people were really telling me, oh, that's a great resource because we can go to the materials. We can talk about personal body safety lessons, or you refer to the student code of conduct or the employee code of conduct, and those things are in this notebook. And I'm not going to go through each of the tabs, but just wanted to make sure the public knew everything was posted on the website. So this is foundational information about the MCPS policy on child abuse and the basis for our presentation that was requested by the Ed Committee last year. So as appropriate, I just wanted to tell you that items were updated, as Mr. Howard said. For example, the student rights and responsibilities, of course, each year that's updated. The employee code of conduct is updated. So those things you'll see in there. And also, since we last met, we submitted our 2018 annual report on child abuse and neglect. And that gives all the numbers. It provides specific information about how we continue to heighten our vigilance and efforts around child abuse, and then also the improvements in infrastructure and training that undergirds the fidelity of implementation of that work and of the policy. So we made additional significant improvements to our protocols and practices, but we're still, of course, deeply concerned anytime there's an incident of suspected abuse or neglect, and any time that there's an incident that violates the standards we've set forward for our employees. So we'll keep learning from our practices and from individual cases from the ongoing input and feedback that we get internally and also from external stakeholders. And so Mr. Edmonds is going to briefly highlight some key areas of implementation for this school year.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Greg Edmondson, coordinator in the compliance unit, Office of Chief of Staff, working closely with Dr. Hollingshead. So we do continue to require, with regards to staff training, all of our MCPS staff to complete mandatory and annual mandatory compliance training that includes modules specific to child safety. Specifically, we do have a recognizing and reporting child abuse and neglect module, which is our most extensive module of our training. It also includes other areas with regards to sexual harassment and bullying, suicide prevention, gangs, and the like. But our recognizing and reporting module is our most extensive to ensure that we do assimilate some of the other situations of that training within child abuse and neglect. We also train as part of our annual mandatory compliance, employee code of conduct training. So that training includes social media and best practices. What we're trying to reach, what we are aiming to reach with our employees is that appropriate interaction within our students and families, and making sure that everybody's on the same page with what would be acceptable and approachable social media engagement, as well as just things that could happen within the school and how we use our technology in the school. This coming fall, we're implementing a brand new training module called Safety in the Digital Age, and that's going to include student security data and how we're, as staff, protecting the privacy of our students, as well as communicating with them about that. And just, it's going to help ensure relationships with our kids that are appropriate and acceptable within our schools. We continue to have screenings and background checks for all of our employees. We run that through both a Maryland and FBI criminal database. It includes fingerprinting of all of our employees, making sure that we have those high expectations for professionalism prior to being hired within our system. On our school safety page, we do have, in our OHRD Human Resources website, we do have all of those stipulations available to the public as well. Including in that, starting in 2013, we require Child Protective Services background checks for our employees, making sure we're running through the database with regards to child welfare services. And we also, that started with new employees in 2013, and we have backlog throughout all of our employees prior to 2013. Starting in 2016, we started working our way through. By the end of this year, we'll be done with our high school. So all of our employees, on both sides of 13, making sure everybody's been run through our Child Protective Services training or screening. We have a clearinghouse with National Association of State Directors that we run through all of our certified educators to ensure credentials. So if we hire somebody coming from another district or outside the state, we make sure that their credentials have never been revoked or removed for any type of purpose, especially a purpose with regards to any type of child abuse and neglect or any type of inappropriate behavior with children, of course. And we did implement back in 2016 a self-reporting expectation where all our employees are required to self-report any arrests, charges, and convictions. And employees who fail to report any arrest or charge or conviction in compliance with this regulation, they are subject to disciplinary action, including and up to dismissal. Background checks and these other things that I've just shared, they unfortunately only have the names of people who have already been caught. And like Councilmember Rice mentioned, we hire human beings, and we want to make sure that we do the best possible job of hiring and screening and training all of our employees. But again, we also want to be on the proactive end to make sure that there's a training and there's an understanding understanding of an expectation with our employees. So what we do moving forward with regards to that understanding is we educate staff to increase awareness of you mentioned in the home, of course, of what child abuse and neglect looks like. what abuse looks like on a mental, or emotional, or physical level, but also within our schools. So going out to schools and training our staff on being able to identify quickly if you see something inappropriate going on with a staff member and a student, and being able to understand the signs of grooming way ahead of maybe when something gets significant or just inappropriate, to be able to know what those reporting expectations are with their supervisors or with Child Protective Services, and of course with our police and state's attorney's office. Our goal is to develop confidence, and the confidence in our staff to know how to handle any situation, but also the confidence of our community and of our students, so that they do feel safe when they're in our buildings. We've implemented, and we will be implementing, what we call personal body safety lessons. And so these lessons are going into every single one of our classrooms to meet every single one of our students, pre-K through 12, going through an understanding of our body, understanding what safety is, what we should expect from adults, and what we should expect from not only our adults and our families, but our adults and our staff and the people who are assigned to educate us. We provide training for our volunteers and for our coaches. That training includes any chaperone who's going to be attending an extended day trip, or like an outdoor ed type of thing, where they are going to be completely fingerprinted and run through a criminal background check. Also, and we mentioned in the previous presentation, the visitor management system, and making sure that we understand who's coming into our buildings at all times. It's very important. We do have the MOU, which others have mentioned, with regards to our work with CPS and Special Victims Division. We streamline our reporting process with regards to suspected abuse, so we have a real clear, linear understanding of when something is reported to CPS and how it's also reported through central office in MCPS, and then so we can talk, and we can talk quickly. And Wendy Greer, who's been an amazing partner from Child Welfare Services, are on top of each one of our cases, and we make sure that there's follow-up and there's follow-through, so that our kids are being protected as much as possible. And then again, not to repeat, but security systems, security cameras on our buses and within our schools is going to help us with some of this work as well. We do feel our practices are ahead of others, but we also know, and we're very cognizant, that we can get better. We want to get better. We want to continue to improve, continue communication, but also build on that confidence that we need for not only our staff, but all of our community here at MCPS. And thank you.
So I want to take a moment to mention the strong collaboration, since we have our community partners here. And in policy JHC, it's and codified in our memorandum of understanding. We have a high-functioning, effective, multidisciplinary team that was formed by MCPS and our county partners to establish procedures for the purpose of reporting and investigating child abuse and neglect. So the team includes representatives from the Child Welfare Services, Montgomery County State's Attorney's Office, the County Attorney's Office, Special Victims Investigation Division, and the Treehouse Child Assessment Center of Montgomery County with MCPS. Actually, Lieutenant Heidrich, who's with the Special Victims Investigations Division, he was going to be here. He has a training that's conflicting with today. So we meet regularly, and it's the infrastructure for immediate interagency communication and collaboration. So I think that this is just an exemplar for what it looks like when the agencies work together. And it's not just during the meeting, but it's also outside the meetings. When we have a case come up, we call each other, we get information. We work closely with the police department and say, okay, we know this is under investigation. However, our community's, just begging for information, and that's always been a bad place that we've been stuck in, where we don't want to go against what the police are doing to in any way upset the investigation, but yet community members want to know, and rightfully so. They want to know if their children are safe, and so we collaborate with the police and say, okay, how much information can we share at this point, and can you help us out? And but I think we go to with Child Protective Services too, where parents want to know what's happened, if it's not that actual parent who was the alleged perpetrator, but if it's someone outside of the family, and then talking about what kind of information we can share. It's a very, very touchy subject. It's a family in crisis when a child's been abused. And so we have to really tread carefully in how this information is shared, but we work closely to determine how much, when, what gets shared. In the notebook under tab E1, there's specific data from last year around abuse and neglect. That's the annual report that's called for by our policy on child abuse and neglect. And just to call out, last year we had 3,087 suspected incidents of child abuse and neglect that were reported by either MCPS staff, volunteers, or contractors to child welfare services or adult protective services. And of those 3,087 cases, 357 involved MCPS staff or contractors. So that roughly 10%. So when we say we had over 3,000 cases, people think, oh my gosh, that's the staff. No, it's not. It's unfortunately, no matter who does it, it's bad. But frequently it's within the home that's occurring. And it's cases that we report as students come to school presenting as injured or with mental abuse or that sort of thing, where they feel there's a trusted adult at the school where they can report. So no case is good, but we're glad when those children report to us. And then of those 357 staff involved, you'll see in the chart, there were 10 that had credible evidence. So not defending any one of those 10, but just to give the public a sense of the number of cases, how many are involving MCPS staff, and how many actually end up where there's credible evidence. And so people ask us about that 300 plus number, like, how do you get so many? And I want people to know that in MCPS, we tell people err on the side of reporting suspected cases of abuse and neglect. So what does that look like? It can look like a staff member seeing children running down the hall and then grabbing one to say, you're going to get hurt, or somebody stepping in front of, out into the parking lot and they grab them by the arm and someone says, oh, that looks like it's a little bit too rough, or that looks like, did they have to use that much force? And they're gonna report it. Now, we've tried to norm those practices and talking to principals and saying, look, if you don't suspect abuse, don't have your staff report it. If you're wondering, then you definitely want to report it. And so we've been working with protective services who they just got inundated as we moved to this new policy and the new procedures. But I think that we're finding, we're kind of norming those practices around, okay, if it is to protect a child, you don't need to report if you don't suspect abuse. Another area where we saw people, I guess I want to call it falsely reporting, not over-reporting, but falsely reporting would be around seeing a child come injured to school and not asking enough questions to say, how did you get hurt? Because they were saying, oh, we don't want to interfere. If we see a child is bruised, we're just going to call CPS. But really, did they fall off their bicycle? Did they, was it some accident and not actual abuse? So that's what those numbers speak to. But I think it's good for us to clarify to the public how much our staff is involved. No case is acceptable. However, that large number is not attributable to MCPS staff.
Let me actually stop
Yes.
you there, because I know that Councilmember Duando has a question specifically about something that you had just said. But let me just say, and again, this is incredibly important, that when folks try and assert somehow that MCPS is trying to hide something, having these numbers out here for all to see is incredibly important, because it, again, highlights to folks, look, these are the numbers, these are what they are. And I know a lot of neighboring jurisdictions do not do this in terms of highlighting this, which is why it's one of the questions I had with staff was, how do we relate and how do we compare to other neighboring jurisdictions? Well, if they don't do the reporting, then therefore it makes it incredibly difficult to benchmark yourself and figure out. I will just say that in the context of how many students we have, one is too many, as you said. However, when you look at the likelihood and what we see in our general society as a whole, and I'm not going to pick on, the Catholic Church, but we're continuing to see these instances happen all over in our lives, unfortunately. And it really is one where there is no true place. And this is one of the things that it's unfortunate, but it needs to be said. It's the reason why we educate, as the father of two young girls, that we educate our children in saying that no place is safe. If you're not safe in your house of worship, if you're not safe sometimes in your own home or with family, I don't know where else you can be safe. And so from that perspective, unfortunately, there are people all around who may not have the best interests of our children at heart. We need to make sure that we have policies in place that encourage reporting, that encourage education of people to be able to get themselves out of situations like that. And if unfortunately they are subject to those, that feel comfortable with telling someone and reporting on those incidents. And I think that what you've espoused here is getting us to that point. Let me turn to Councilmember Jawando.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for the in-depth presentation and for all that you all do to make sure our children are safe at school. Couple of questions I just wanted to, since you brought this up, I was going to wait till the end, but you're right on where I wanted to ask questions. So the outcomes, the reporting by MCPS employees about abuse and neglect, then you just kind of ran through the breakdown, and it looks like there, and over the 3-year period, just under 1,000, if I'm doing the math right, a little over, around between 320 and 350 or so per year. Of staff, right?
About 10% a year.
About 10% a year. The high number that are screened out, which you define as insufficient evidence that abuse or neglect occurred, as opposed to ruled out, where you determine that it didn't occur, correct? And could you talk to me how, that just seems high to me, 87% of the cases are screened out, and what the process looks like. How do you, what's the determination difference between screened out and ruled out, and why, and just help me understand why that number is as high as it is.
Good afternoon. Wendy Greer, Child Protective Services Manager. So in screening cases in, they have to meet a certain criteria under COMAR for abuse or neglect. And if the incident doesn't rise to that, they get screened out. If it does rise to that and the cases are assigned and investigated, if it doesn't meet the definition of what abuse or neglect is, then in the investigation, the disposition is a rule out.
So, okay, let me just make sure I understand. So if it doesn't meet a standard, which I'm going to ask you about in a second, then it's just screened out. It's not investigated.
Right. So the state has a standard
Sure.
for when you're reporting abuse or neglect. And if it doesn't rise to that standard, screeners use a tool along the whole jurisdictions in Maryland. And if it doesn't rise to that, then it's screened out.
And so there's a protocol. I'm assuming there's like guidance to who's doing that, who's making that evaluation.
So it's the clinical social workers and child welfare services that receive the reports from the community. So they screen in the calls. And if the calls don't meet, what's reported doesn't meet the criteria for a screened-in investigation.
Regardless of what the veracity of it, just what's being accused or purported to have happened, correct? So
Correct.
just objectively, assuming it happened, if X activity took place, if it was against the policy, then it would be screened in. If just objectively it's not, you're not making a judgment about whether the person's telling the truth or not. You're just saying
Right.
if the conduct alleged.
Based on the policy, if the information reported meets the criteria, regardless of anything else, then we either screen it in or screen it out.
For further investigation.
Right, so if we screened it out, that means it didn't meet criteria, we're not investigating. If we screen it in, then it gets assigned to a team for investigation. And then that team commences the assessment or investigation with or without the police.
So a very small amount of cases are being screened in then. And so you have the vast majority, 87% are screened out. So tell me, can you just give me an example of something that, it just seems like there'd be a big disconnect in what people think is abuse and neglect.
So
and
Dr. Hollingshead gave you an example that we get quite often if a child is running through the hallway or running into the parking lot and is grabbed by a teacher and someone else sees it and reports it as abuse. That's something that we would look at and say, well, you know, were there injuries? What was the contents of it or the context of it? What happened? And then that would be a decision that we would make to screen it out.
So there is some investigation then done before, because because a grab of an arm could be, I would imagine, if it's a grab and a yank or a pull down, I mean, it could be different types of grabs that could be screened in or screened out. So there is some level of subjective determination made by somebody to screen out.
There's questioning by the screener about the incident, And one of the things we always want to know if it's a physical abuse, for instance, so a grabbing of an arm, is there an injury? Did the child have to seek medical attention? Was the child hurt in any way? Those are screening questions that are asked by a reporting source.
Are those available in here? In the book that you provided, the screening questions?
No.
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 Okay. Yeah, go ahead if you want to comment. I have another question, but go ahead.
No, I just want to say that there are, even though CPS may screen something out, that doesn't mean that we don't follow up on our own with our own investigation. So if a CPS report is made, then we'll follow up at the school level, at the central office level, depending on what it is, to their code of conduct and also,
You'll do your own.
disciplinary actions based on that incident, right? So maybe it is somebody grabbing an arm or grabbing by the shoulder to redirect, but then someone else says, every time I see this teacher, they're redirecting kids, and then we will follow up with our own code of
It may
conduct.
not be abusive, but it's
So that's what I was
inappropriate
gonna
by our
say.
code of conduct within employees.
Got it. And so
That's the next process. If we screen it out, then it's a phone call to our partner here and say, this is not a case we're going to take for an investigation, but you may want to look at it.
And then we've also had cases where we'll talk and they'll say, we're not going to investigate this one, but it's raising some questions, so we really then will be eyes on that employee and look into their record and see if there's anything else.
got it. Okay, that's helpful. So there's that pass off.
Right, a lot of dialogue.
Rise to your level. Okay, great. Thank you for that. It just seemed odd, and that explains some of the difference there. And the other, sir, you mentioned is it Mr. Edmondson? Yes. Okay. You mentioned the modules that are part of this new push.
Yes.
Those are online, kind of, explain to me what,
So the user takes, it's on a computer, it's not accessible online for everyone. Once you're an employee, you can access to it. It's a digital online module that all of our employees, 24,000 this past year, went through. We also
sit through and go through, kind of,
sit through and go through models. For example, child abuse and neglect is 40 minutes module, taking them through not only all of the expectations, but also all the documents and forms that are needed, so they're actually uploaded onto the module. And then they'll move on, once they pass or get credit for that, then they'll go to, let's say, a suicide prevention module or a gangs and gang-related activity module. And we have 11 in total that all of our employees complete.
and is there some sort of, they have to take here's what you learned or answer some
So
questions?
there's checks for understanding within the module. So as you're walking, you might get a voiceover with information and content. You might see a couple images. You might see a form you have to click on and read it before you move forward. So it'll direct you to say, upload policy JHC or whatever it is. And once you read it, then you have to move forward. But if you don't open it and read it, you can't move forward on the module. And then throughout, there might be checks for understanding where are these circumstances or these scenarios, could they be classified as, say, discrimination, or could they be classified as abusive? And yes or no, and that helps you move through the module.
Are there, in addition to that, are there any in-person kind of trainings that are done to supplement the module that's on?
So we reinforce the modules through, we have principal meetings, 206 principals to talk about like maybe common errors we're seeing or over-reporting. Child Protective Services will tell us, we see a number of these types of errors, or the form is not being filled out correctly. So this year, we've already had a training on that at the beginning of the year. We talked to principals, say, make sure X, Y, and Z. We gave them the quick guide, which is also in here, to say, these are all the steps. It's the A to Z of what you have to do when you're reporting abuse and neglect. And then we also do refreshers during the year. So we have regular principal meetings and assistant principal meetings. So it's part of the training program for our leadership development program, the child abuse and neglect and other
Every school has
areas.
a child abuse and neglect liaison, child abuse and neglect / Title IX liaison. And I have trained each of these liaisons through, in addition to the module, in addition to the compliance training, and then given them resources and guidance to go back to their schools to do refreshers within their, let's say, departments or whole school, depending on the needs of that school or the situation that might be at hand, or the request of the, let's say, the community or the staff to go deeper into what reporting practices and what's the steps for following, let's say, a specific scenario. So yes, it's not just sit there through the computer and then I passed and
Sometimes you
I'm
hear
moving on.
From teachers, I've heard anecdotally in regards to a lot of training, you just got to go through it, and it's not really contextualized sometimes, and so it sounds like there's some layered on.
Definitely, there's the assessments that are within our applications of the policy. So here's a scenario, they're scenario-based, tests for understanding.
And the
Councilmember Giammatteo, I just want to share with you on that point, because I think it's important. As a parent, and you'll get to this very soon, as you start to decide you may want to volunteer as a volunteer within the schools, you actually have to go through that module. It's not something where, oftentimes with modules, you can just press play, and then when it's done, you've completed the module. It doesn't allow you to do that. It's very interactive. I'm not going to say I tried to do that. I'm just going to say that it was very clear that you had to be interactive in terms of answering all the questions and sit down for that entire time and answer questions that actually tested whether or not you were paying attention for the 5 minutes that it went through that particular piece of that module. And the whole thing was actually about like 40 minutes. I mean, it was...
Volunteer training, yes.
Yes, it was, yeah.
And that's
See, I remember.
accessible to anyone on the web, the volunteer training. We're hoping as many people who want to take that, take it.
I'm gonna go. I can't wait. Back to
We do get outside groups and districts who ask about it and go on it and look, see if they can use parts of it. So it's highly regarded from outside of our system as well.
We also do face-to-face training with PPWs. So CPS goes and meets with them during their quarterly meetings, and we train around recognizing and reporting, or around scenarios that they come across with around child abuse and neglect as well.
Wonderful. And then just my last point, and thank you for answering the questions. Back to the screened out. So they're screened out. You pass them on. You do some, MCPS does some level of follow-up. How is that related to this other table 3, the other chart here, where there's action warranted or memo for the record? Are those related?
Right, that's what we
the
do within
follow-up.
Yes, that's our follow-up. So it could be, any number of things in disciplinary action you see listed there.
But
So
all
that would be-
868 screened out would be captured.
Whenever there's a
that.
case, then we're going to, with our employees, we are committed to investigating after CPS does theirs, because we don't want to overlap an investigation. But once they've completed their work, then we do our follow-up, any report of CPS, to CPS of employees.
Awesome. Thank you very much.
And just as a final note on this report, it's 10 pages of data, information. I mean, we're putting in the people that are, the letters that we're sending out, cases of certificates revoked. This is a type of transparency that we have seen nowhere else in any other system. And in fact, as I've called other systems, they talk to me like I'm crazy, like, we can't believe you put that out there. So I have yet to find anyone in the Washington metro area who's putting out a 10-page report annually that highlights all of the incidents and talks about the lawsuits that we've had against the system. So I think it's pretty comprehensive.
Seems like a great standard of transparency, and thank you for walking me through it.
Councilmember Albornoz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Once again, another really distinguished and important panel. This is a sobering subject. I had the opportunity last week to visit the Treehouse and walk through one of their real-life scenarios that had recently occurred with the 12-year-old girl who was a student in Montgomery County Public Schools. Of course, they protected her personal information, did not disclose which school, but apparently she had been through a sexual education course and disclosed to the teacher who had been teaching that course that something had happened. And over the course of a few days, was advised by the counselor and then referred to the Treehouse. And it made me sick to my stomach. When I had heard what occurred, it was her uncle who had been sexually assaulting her, and she had wanted to speak up earlier than this, but there was an immigration issue, and so she was reluctant to bring the case forward for fear of the unintended consequence of potential deportation of her family. So my question is with regards to cultural competency and how that specifically is addressed or incorporated in the training provided to staff. How is that addressed? How does that come into play? And then I do have a follow-up question regarding my specific visit and Child Protective Services, but if we could start there, that would be great.
Every student, pre-K through 12, receives the personal body safety lessons at the grade level that's appropriate. We also, based on last year we had, the horrific incidents at Cloverly Elementary School, and parents were saying, give us the information too. So now on the web, please, parents, go see that. It's how you talk to your children about personal body safety. The idea is to get as many people to understand what they need to do to report what's not right, because I think a lot of this plays into children just being so young, they don't know what's not appropriate. They don't understand, but so that's what these lessons are directing them to. So it's just a way to make sure that everybody, at this point, I'd say, with the volunteer training, with personal body safety lessons, with our staff training, we've have over 250,000 people in the county that have received some kind of child protection awareness that didn't exist before. So that's something we're pretty proud of, to say that we're putting it out there. And, if anybody who will listen to us, we're telling you, please, this is what you need to do. This is what it looks like, and this is how you report. Specific to cultural proficiency, I can't speak to that other than to say that every child is getting this, regardless of who they are, where they came from, what their circumstances. So I think that what works for us in any situation is that when children feel they have a trusted adult in the school that they can talk to, and I think Debbie Feinstein has been a real champion for us in saying, these classes, these personal body safety lessons have really brought out more people to report, because that's what she's hearing in her cases, and I'll let her speak to that herself, but they just have to feel like there's somebody in the school that they can talk to, and that's something we really work hard on, the relationship building and making sure that every child has somebody in the building who's their trusted adult they feel comfortable talking to.
I think perhaps as part of that training, being sensitive to those unique circumstances with regards to immigration status, and just reinforcing that a student should come forward. And I know, I'm sure that's part of it, but particularly in schools where we have such a high percentage of students who are in that situation, I think if I'd feel better knowing if there were some additional layer of support provided to arm teachers, because at the session that I happened to attend, it was eye-opening on so many different levels, but there were a number of teachers. I was in a group of all educators. There were about 30 of us that went through this session. And half of the teachers that were there commented on not really thinking about or not really processing the unique circumstance that this girl found herself in, and what to do with that.
So I think one of the barriers to that is that in the school system, we don't know who is, undocumented. We don't have, that's not part of the child's records. So certainly, if that's something we see that's impeding, a barrier, then that would be, if we are aware of it, then we would act. But that's just not information that we normally have. But I understand the plight you're just describing of this child, and it's pretty tragic.
Right. And then I will say, while I was there, our state's attorney got a huge kudos. There was great comments about how supportive from the Treehouse's perspective, and what a partner the state's attorney's office is, and how sensitive you guys are in helping shepherd families through what is the most awful of crises. I do want to acknowledge just how important our Child Protective Services is. But there was a sense that I got that you guys are overloaded, and that there was a sense from some of the teachers, and this is purely anecdotal. This is purely anecdotal, based on one afternoon session that made me want to go home and cry. But there were teachers that reported and asked if they could go directly to the Treehouse, because they felt that they had reported a case, and that given just the capacity of Child Protective Services, that maybe the case hadn't received the attention that it deserved. And again, purely anecdotal. But I know how hard you guys work and how difficult this work is. So if you could comment about, and be honest about what your capacity is within the office as you receive these cases.
Okay, so we have one unit dedicated to investigating child sexual abuse and fatalities. That's a unit of 7 social workers who are licensed clinical social workers. Part of the problem is confidentiality. Teachers always want to know, what are you doing, child welfare service, like every step of the way, and unfortunately we can't tell them that every step of the way. The only time they can get information is sometimes when we have a family involvement meeting, and it's a meeting that we have with the family to try to make plans for children, and lots of times we'll invite the community, like teachers, counselors, clergy, friends, whoever, to come to the meeting and sit and hear the whole story. So unfortunately, school only hears a piece of it, and then they assume we're not doing anything because we're not, calling them back and telling them step by step. I think what happens is I'll communicate with Dr. Hollingshead or Mr. Edmondson to give them clarification if I need to about this is what we're doing, maybe we should do this, so that they on that level know what's going on. Yes, we are very overwhelmed with cases, unfortunately, but we're doing the best that we can with who we have, and partnering with the Treehouse is extremely helpful. Partnering with the police is extremely helpful in these really difficult, serious cases, and communicating with the school.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Council President Navarro.
Thank you so much for this briefing. So I think that, especially as we get into the budget deliberations, I think it would be really important for HHS committee to maybe host also a session more in-depth talking about child protective services. We get into this routine, where there are particular budgetary goals that everybody has to achieve and targets, and I feel like it's so frustrating that every year, we know anecdotally that there is no way that, Child Protective Services probably has enough staff to deal with what we need to deal with, but I'm also sensitive that many times it's not as if you can come here and say, I need, 5 more social workers. It is our job to try to understand that regarding, what are the standards and what is your caseload, but it is important because it's such a big, component of this conversation. I will also say that I really appreciate Councilmember Albornoz bringing up this issue of cultural proficiency. To be honest, I just assumed that this was incorporated because, we have been engaged in this conversation for so many years. And I understand that we don't ask for immigration status, but I think that we can extrapolate, given our demographics, our student demographics, that we probably have a lot of students who may not themselves be undocumented, but maybe living with relatives who may be abusing them. We have, I think, at this point, should know that this is real and that many, I think young people might feel threatened. And there's just so much rhetoric out there that they may not feel comfortable, stepping up. So for MCPS to be the school system that it is with the demographic that it has and not incorporate this, I have to say I'm a little bit shocked. We should know better. And so I really hope that this will be incorporated and that, when students are informed about all of this, that there is a way that is cultural proficient to explain that you should come forward, that there will not be this kind of repercussion, that there are ways that you can communicate. Because going back to conversation about the Street Outreach Network, we have a real interesting source of a lot of information there, right? Because they deal really closely, and I know they have a really good partnership with you. But this is not unusual, where we see, especially, teenagers, et cetera, who are sometimes trafficked, who are sometimes, abused under the guise and threat of, hey, then, we'll turn in your mom, or we'll do this. So it is imperative, and especially because they spend so much time in the schools, to be able to incorporate something like this in that training, and for teachers to also know that they should be, aware of this also. So I really hope that gets taken care of, very soon.
I would say I'm Gillian Hubner. I'm from the MCCPTA Subcommittee on School Climate and Safety. And I think that fear of reprisal is huge culturally, but also students are afraid of being held accountable, and parents are actually quite afraid. So I think that's something that we as the MCCPTA is trying to do to ensure that people feel protected in coming forward and know that we have their backs when they do and that they will not suffer consequences, because you're putting yourself in an extraordinarily vulnerable position, especially when you're talking about a teacher or a principal or a parent. So I think that's something that we're trying to work through as we have a committee now, a stakeholders group, which is referenced in here. And one of the things that we're hoping to do is to make sure that community members are feeding into our process as we reevaluate how to do that, so that we understand where the blockages are for them doing the right thing. Because obviously the procedures are very clear, but that doesn't take into account the amount of emotional pressure and fear that one might feel coming forward.
Absolutely, that's such a great point. But again, with especially those students who may be willing to step up if they at least heard it, right? Because one thing is to hear all of this and be aware of it, but what a difference if that adult also says, and if for any reason there are any issues regarding, immigration or we will find a safe space to protect you. That just makes a huge difference in a child's mind or in a teenager's mind that, okay, it's being acknowledged. I'm not going to crazy thinking that this is a thing. I can, move right ahead. So I would just offer that as a very important aspect of this conversation as well. Thank you.
Not to pile on, but let me just say that I do believe that it's a very easy conversation for us to add that as a part of the standard, understanding that it may not be applicable for every student, but it may be applicable for some. And it doesn't hurt to have it in there, to have that conversation. And so putting that as a part of the standard then assumes that regardless of whether you need it or not, the information is there. So it makes it easy. So I'll turn back to you, Ms. Hollingshead.
So rest assured, we'll follow up on that, because we are looking for that kind of input. Any barriers to reporting or getting help to children, we're on it. So I wanted, actually, Mr. Edmondson's going to talk about this committee. So Councilmember Rice, that was something you started with last time and said, why don't you? And so we did. So here's the details on our community stakeholder.
Great, thank you. A copy of our project charter sheet is, I believe, right on the back of the first page of your binder, but I'll just go through some of the aspects of this committee. Again, recommended by Councilmember Rice back in August. We worked with several different stakeholders in order to come to the point where we had our first meeting, which took place just this past January. Our next meeting is up and coming in just a week or two. Our charge statement is, again, I think Gillian shared it very nicely, that we are a cross-functional group of several different stakeholders out there in order to come together and really learn about all that we can with regards to prevention, recognition, and making sure that with regards to reporting and just things that come up about within our conversations, we focus on continuous improvement within MCPS, but we also want to make sure that we have that open communication and dialogue. We look at the group and we have people from like MCC PTA and our state's attorney's office and child welfare services and security. You heard from Ed Clark earlier. He's a part of our work. Security is a part of our work. But not only so that we can be better within ourselves, but we can also take the information that we're learning in a proactive way and take it back to our stakeholders so that they're more, when I mentioned earlier about confidence, they're more able to have an understanding of what's going on within MCPS and the agencies that we work with so closely. We see this as a whole county system. Obviously, we're MCPS, the two of us, but we want to make sure that our whole county is benefiting from this. For example, we are bringing in a Dr. Conley, I think she was referenced earlier, who is an expert on trauma within our students in schools, and she's going to share Dr. Smith's initiative moving forward with physical, social, and psychological well-being, which is an initiative that's moving forward. And so that's going to inform our stakeholder group to be able to think about how that's going to impact our work. And as well, our stakeholder group is going to go out and things like MCC PTA will have a better understanding of how we're moving forward with that. You could see through the deliverables that we're reviewing our policies and regulations to make sure that we've thought of everything that we need to think about from different angles and different aspects. Sharing current practices, as I mentioned, we have a specific child abuse and neglect process that we follow. Reviewing, we won't review specific cases or reports, but maybe in general, how we handle certain things and how we communicated that to the community and how we can improve on communication to the community, which we think is incredibly important. Things that are out of scope, but like I said, individual specific cases, as well as just for confidentiality, there's certain groups or certain aspects that we won't bring into the group because we want to be able to learn from a general basis, especially with that aspect of it. Positive in nature, very meaningful as part of our critical to our quality, a commitment to attending meetings, and really being at the head of the most recent research that we can involve within our stakeholder group. We feel really good about where we're going with this. Again, we started at mid-year this year, but hope to expand it and to really get in depth with the work as we move forward. So we're excited about that. Thank you for the recommendation.
Oh, and thank you for moving quickly with this. I think this is a great opportunity for us to really bring everyone together, collective minds, to really get us to a much better place. Always acknowledging we're doing great stuff, but we can do even better with that collaboration. Let me turn to Council President Navarro.
Yeah, this is amazing. This is really, really thorough. I see that this is a one-year rotation, is that right, the membership? So I would just strongly, again, I don't want to sound like a broken record, but given the Latino students are the largest student body group, it would be great to have some Latino parent or other kind of representation.
Right, so we did
as
send
you
out
rotate.
invitations to our student achievements for Latino, Hispanic, as well as African American. What's that?
You have Sonia, I know who's.
Yes, okay, so, yeah,
But,
apologize if I
so
missed.
this is
but
our first round, and so we're still working on.
No, I
making sure we have
understand.
And I think we
But
get
your point is well made.
This
and
is
we-
my last term on the council, and I'm just a little short on patience, so I'm sorry. But I just think that, again,
Yeah, of course.
Given who the student population is, it is very important to be very proactive and make sure that you include stakeholders that have a good sense of, what's happening in those communities and be able to then report back to you.
And that's critical to the
And
success of
like
this
I
group.
said, the invitations went out, we'll be as diligent as we can to get.
Right, yeah, sometimes you just have to be a little more proactive, I mean, we do have now a member of the board, Ms. Carla Silvestri, who can probably facilitate some of that. I know that there are some folks who are, pretty active, Antonio Cardoso. I mean, there's a lot of people who've done a lot of work that could be, I think, really useful here, because this is an issue that is of great importance in that community and a great concern. So it'd be great to have some folks in there.
Absolutely, thank you.
I'm wondering if we could have Ms. Feinstein get some airtime, because she's really been supportive of our work, and it's a great collaboration. So, thanks.
Ms. Feinstein, good to see you.
Nice to see you as well. Good afternoon. I'm Debbie Feinstein. I'm Chief of the Special Victims Division for the State's Attorney's Office. I come here sometimes wearing different hats. As you all know, my division not only handles the child abuse cases, domestic violence, human trafficking, elder abuse, sexual assault. So I appear in front of you in many capacities, but I will tell you that the work that I've done with MCPS over the last number of years, really since 2015, when a lot of the initiatives that MCPS has brought forward, I've been involved since that time, even to the extent of the modules that we've been talking about with respect to the training. Those were all reviewed by, by my office, I know by Child Welfare Services, just to make sure that they were really hitting everything. It definitely struck me when you were mentioning the cultural competency piece, because I will certainly confirm what Councilmember Albornoz saw the other day with respect to the pressures that are brought to bear for immigration consequences. We see that across the board with respect to reporting criminal conduct, and we certainly see it in great numbers with respect to our child victims of abuse and neglect, because they are already being brought, so many pressures are being brought on them with respect to, reporting a family member or a friend for abusing them, and then the pressures that are brought to bear. And I will tell you, we've also prosecuted the non-touching parent, the non-offending parent, as you will, for shutting down a child from reporting. That is permissible under the law, and we do that as well, and we are very well, very knowledgeable of that, and the way that the U visa issue is utilized as well. And I think that your point certainly was I was very much hearing what you both were saying with respect to the importance of our children knowing that. And I was thinking about that for all of the education that we do for our kids. As you know, I'm in the schools all the time on the Choose Respect, Teen Dating Violence Prevention Initiative, and I think we need to add that in there as well. In a more direct way. But with respect to the issues that we're here for today, just a couple of comments that I know are reflected in the materials that you all have, but I've also had an opportunity to comment on in the past. And I think the first is with respect to the personal body safety lessons and the correlation between when those safety lessons are offered in the classrooms and when we see the reports coming in. There is a high correlation. There's absolutely no question. Every single MCPS report that is filed comes across my desk. My poor administrative aide, who's amazing, literally opens all the envelopes, and there are hundreds. And it is not uncommon in those forms to see that a child is disclosing after a personal body safety lesson. And as I've said from the beginning of this process and working with MCPS, the fact that we are educating thousands of our community members on the issue of child abuse prevention, what it looks like, how to help someone, how to help yourself, to me is an incredible thing that our community and that MCPS has taken the lead on, because it's not only 24,000 employees, it's, as was referenced by Councilmember Rice, all of the teachers, all of the parents, the volunteers, the contractors, anyone that wants to set foot in an MCPS school or program has to have this training. And how amazing is that our community does that? I can only hope that we will see, and I've said this many times before, and I'm sure you've heard me say this, that we want our community to become inhospitable for folks that perpetrate child abuse, that they know that we are knowledgeable, that they know that the information is being provided on a regular basis to thousands of our community members and puts people on notice. So that's really, from a prevention standpoint, as someone from the state's attorney's office, that I can't think of anything better. So I don't have a lot more to add. I'm really here in a supporting role, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you have for me, but I'm certainly a minor player here today, but I did want to make those points, so thank you for the opportunity.
Well, let me just say, Ms. Feinstein, just that I've been a fan of your work for a very long time, so I certainly don't consider you a minor player. You are a key part.
Anybody that knows her would.
Yeah, exactly. You are a key player in terms of making sure that our community knows that when these kinds of things happen, that we are going to vigorously pursue them to the fullest extent of the law. And it's not as though we are just, slapping someone's hand. We want to make sure that folks understand. And I loved what you said, that, we are not tolerable to these kinds of things happening in our community, and really want to do what we can to make that message felt so that folks know who are those kinds of perpetrators, not the first-time offenders, because those you can't really screen, but for those who are perpetrators who know, well, if I go to Montgomery County, folks know and are looking for, and I'm going to be vigorously prosecuted against, is a great deterrent, right? At least for some. And so from that perspective, it really does matter a lot. And it breeds a culture as people see, as victims see other people who are being prosecuted for these feel more comfortable about coming forward, knowing that folks will believe them, that folks will follow their story, will give them the support necessary, and continue to make sure that we create a system that is supportive of folks who unfortunately have to deal with these kinds of tragic situations. So let me turn back to you, Ms. Hollingshead, for any.
We appreciate your time, and every time we come, we learn something new. We hear from, you're representing so many different stakeholders. It's helpful to our work, so we appreciate that. And definitely from the last time we were here, you had a number of recommendations which we have acted on, and we're better for that, so thank you.
Yeah, and let me just say again, being a continued partner with us and understanding that there are always ways in which we can get better. We've identified some today, so thank you, Councilmember Albornoz and Council President Navarro for highlighting that and ways in which we can continue to expand. I think that the points that were made by my colleagues as a whole say that, look, we're doing a really great job, but there are some things that we can delve into, as well as the understanding. And so, Councilmember Jawando's questioning actually is a really good one, because a lot of folks don't know all that's involved in terms of that process. And so it's really important for us to maybe even spell out what the process is as a part of our website as well. So, maybe that's something that the group can take up and figure out how to make our website even more robust about spelling out for folks how it works, right? And so we learn here because we're asking the questions, but for a lot of folks who don't know and aren't understanding of that process, I think that'd be a good thing for us to do as well. Yep. Okay, all right. Well, thank you very much. We are adjourned, but thank you for your great work. Continue being vigilant, and we look forward to standing alongside you. So thank you. We're adjourned.